So the first thing I want to do is talk about the midterm. So midterm is 48 hours from right now. You'll want to like settle down because I'm going to go over details here. Some of this I've already said, some of it's on the course website, and some of it is in the Q&A, the general Q&A. People have been asking questions about the midterm. In one case, I actually put sample questions up, so you may want to go through that. Midterm, 48 hours from now, Thursday, in here, you only need to bring a pencil. If you're a DSP student, you also only need to bring a pencil, but you should know your accommodations now. If not, you can see Aisha, who at the end of class, or you can email her to make sure you're set with DSP. So looking at this, we will not do lecture number 9. We're only going to do 8. You're only responsible for the material up to including 8. That's today. We will finish it today. As far as readings are concerned, if you saw on the syllabus, you know there was no reading for this week because I wanted to give you extra time to prepare for the midterm. So you have the readings from week 1 through 4, everything up to including that. But pay attention. You do have to watch the documentary for this week, which is either Minimalism or the alternate film. That's a little confusing because you don't have to comment on that until Friday or Sunday night or like super early Monday morning. But you have to watch Minimalism before Thursday because it could be on the midterm. And my suggestion would be maybe to utilize your time well. Watch it, but then don't bother to make your YouTube comment until after the exam, because you'll have like 3 days to do it and you won't be, doing it at the same time as exam prep. But if you want to make the comment, you absolutely can. So that's the midterm. We had sample questions. It should be pretty straightforward. Make sure you've read everything. Make sure you've watched all the documentaries. Make sure that you've either come to the lectures or all the lectures are up, including this one will go up today. So you can watch them for the course website on YouTube, or alternately, GauchoCast has the recordings that they're making from the booth. But the ones that we're doing from here are probably a little better, which are the YouTube videos. In both cases, with GauchoCast and YouTube, the transcript what's being generated right now is going to be available. So you know how to do this with YouTube. GauchoCast has the same thing. If you want to quickly go over the lectures, you probably want to just deal with the transcripts. You can also go over the closed captioning, which is in essence the transcript for the documentaries too. So it should be pretty straightforward. But just make sure you've done everything because everything will be covered, including, don't forget to watch those little 5-minute shorts that I do on YouTube that you're commenting on. Some people watch the documentary, like say Minimalism, and then they jump right in and make a comment without watching what I've said. And what I've said frames it and consequently could be on the midterm. So let's jump right into number 8. Notice how far we've come in the course. From down here, we're up now to about 700 in the Christian era. And this is going to be an important milestone for us since this is an English class we're dealing with literature, contemporary literature. This is going to be the beginning of English literature. Also notice now space-wise, we've moved out of Northern Africa. We've been in the Greek Isles here. We've jumped over into mainland Europe, and now we're actually going to be in England, but with Rome as well. So this is it, lecture number. It should take the whole time, number 8, even though, because you'll see there are quite a few for each of these. Okay, The Dream of the Rood, short poem, first text we've read. It's kind of like the Epic of Gilgamesh in the sense that the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the first examples of Western literature. The Dream of the Rood is one of the first examples of English literature. It is ancient, and so much so that they weren't even writing it down textually. This is inscribed, the Dream of the Rood, on the Ruthwell cross. So we're back very far. To put it in context, this is something like Beowulf era as well. And you're going to see when we get to Chaucer, we're going to jump hundreds of years forward. But just so you understand the context here. Ruthwell Cross, 800 years after Virgil. So we've just made a big jump. And Virgil came 700 years after Hesiod. So we're making kind of big jumps here time-wise. And these are important because, especially from the point of view of art, they represent these three eras of Western thinking, Greek thinking, Roman thinking, and then in our case, Anglo-Saxon culture. We could talk about other European literatures and all as well, but this is ours because this gives birth to, well, this is early English literature. And that presents a problem. You're reading it in translation, even though it's English, because this is what it actually looks like in Old English or Anglo-Saxon. Christe besonde Rudi, hefre pesosum param quanum epiletel anum. So you can kind of see this, but I could tell you if you speak German, you probably have as good a chance as reading that as if you speak modern English. I mean, you can see Christ there, you can see the rood, you can see was on, but other words, not so much. So that's why we have to read it in translation, but it also underscores how far back we are. Is it English literature? Yeah, this is English, but it's a very, very ancient English. And it should seem alien to you. So the Ruthwell Cross, you saw that's where it's inscribed on this stone cross, but the version that we're reading comes here from something called the Vercelli book, which is a 10th century, so it's a few centuries later. And this is kind of like what we have with Gilgamesh too. Gilgamesh is the oral tradition, and then we read an amalgam of different versions that were actually put down later. So we're lucky we have this. If we didn't have this, and this is with so many of the texts from this era, they've been lost. But we do have this one, and it's really important. It was really interesting from an environmental point of view. So here we go. Our first iClicker poll for today. Start the poll. Say yes, and that'll go away. Yeah. So I'm curious. Kind of curious who's read it so far because you need to read it now. The readings for this week, which is The Dream of the Rood and Chaucer, are going to be on the midterm for sure. And I'm curious how understandable you found it. And I'll comment on that, but let me just see how understandable you thought it was. Yeah, I wouldn't feel bad if you're not one of the 50 people who found it really understandable. It's confusing, and we're going to walk through this kind of the way we did with Virgil's first eclogue, not quite line by line, but to see what's going on. And it's okay if you're in that group C or even D that you're confused. But I will say for the 150 people who haven't read it, yeah, read it in the next 48 hours. It's going to be on the exam. I'm pretty confident of that. So what's a rood? This is how far back the language is. That word is no longer in English. It's a pole or a cross. And it's important. Why is a cross important? Well, because in Christian iconography, that's what Christ died upon, was a cross. It continued into Shakespeare's time, so we're like the year 1600 with Shakespeare. So for like 800 years, it continued on. So Hamlet, not by the rood, not so, but it kind of fell out of use. Most of the words in the text have fallen out of use, but it doesn't change the meaning, because if you called it the Dream of the Cross, it would matter. So it's a dream, but let's be really clear. You probably realize this, it's not the kind of dream that someone has at night. This is not where someone fell asleep, had a dream, and then woke up with it. This was called a dream, but it really, a more modern phrase would be like a mystical vision. This would be something that someone has. We don't really talk about those people having visions today, unless maybe, you're using like psychedelics or something, you would have a vision, you'd actually see something. In this time, religious folks had visions. It was a known thing. If someone said they had a vision, you'd take it seriously, or at least depending on who had the vision. And what happens here is, what's the dream of, the vision of? It's the cross that Christ died upon. Again, centrally important in Christianity. This person is obviously a Christian who has it. And that cross itself starts speaking to the person, which is so interesting because Jesus is in this scene too. This person has a vision of Jesus, but they're not talking to Jesus and all. The cross is doing all the talking. So I'll explain in the next slide how it works, but keep in mind, and this is why I asked if you found it confusing, there are two different speakers in this work, and they're not having a dialogue. Like, remember the Virgil's first eclogue, Melibellus and Tityrus are going back and forth. It doesn't work that way, but they both are speaking. So let me show you how it works here. It's a frame story. There's a section where the Rood speaks, and there's the section where the dreamer speaks. So how does that work? The first person you hear from is the dreamer, the person that had the dream. It's like if you walked up to this person and they would say, I had this dream of the cross, and the cross started speaking to me. That's the first part. And then the person says, let me tell you exactly what the cross said to me. That's the second part. So the dreamer is actually saying it, but the dreamer is purporting to word by word tell you exactly what the tree said. So the tree then becomes the second speaker, and the dreamer says, here's what he said. And then the tree goes off and talks and tells its story. And that's the central part of the Dream of the Rood. And then at the end, you can imagine, again, someone telling you the story, and that's exactly what they said. And then the dreamer comes back in again and says, that's what the tree said to me, and this is what I think of it and all. So we call it a frame story because imagine it's like a frame. The outer frame is the person's telling the story, and the inner frame is the story. This is used all over the place in literature. If you've read like Wuthering Heights is a perfect example of a frame story. But just don't get confused because it's not like really, highlighted where the switch is happening. You have to look for it carefully. And unfortunately, our translation doesn't do it. It would have been nice if it put the work of the tree, the root in italics or something, but it doesn't. So just you might want to read it again to make sure you're clear. So the first thing I think immediately surprising is that we have an anthropomorphized sentient tree that's speaking here. Let me just take a drink here while you read that. The culture here in ancient England was the Celtic culture. This predates Christianity by thousands of years. Christianity had actually come very quickly into England in the first century after Christ died. It's that quick. But what happened was, it's coming out of Rome, the Roman Empire collapses, and then Christianity falls away for hundreds of years. Christianity is kept alive in some places, like in Irish monasteries in the British Isles, but not much else. And what happens when Christianity fades is the Celtic religion comes back strong. And this is an earth-based religion. This is like what we saw at the beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Celts worship the earth, the sea, the sky, particular features of it. They just like we have, Humbaba representing the cedar forest. There were deities representing streams, lakes, hills, trees, and especially for this story, oak trees. And let me tell you about that. You may have heard the term Druid. You might be familiar with who the Druids are. If you know, like Stonehenge is from the Celtics. It's actual a monument, but it's also a religious site. And religious rituals would have been performed there by Druids. Who were the Druids? They were the religious upper part of it, the ministerial class. And they were encountered by Julius Caesar back when, right around when Virgil's writing. And if you didn't know, Caesar actually spends a few years in the British Isles. So he encounters these people, Druids, and he has to give them a name because that's what all colonists do. They name something other than the actual name of the people. They don't ask who they are. They say, tell them who they are. So he noticed that they worship trees. So Julius Caesar then names these people Druids, which in Latin means sorcerer. So instead of acknowledging that they were legitimate religious leaders, he says they're sorcerers, they're like black magic people. But the word, I think as he knew, derives from Greek, which means oak tree. So who are the Druids? Who is these sorcerers? Who is the religious leaders? They are the people who worship oak trees. So in terms of what we've done, this is not a metaphysical religion. This is a here and now, earth-based religion. You may know a more common term that Christians began calling these folks, still alive and well today, and that's pagan. Pagan also derives from Latin words pagus or pangere, which means to stick something into the ground. It's a verb. So like you get a stick and you stick it in the ground hard, that's pangere. That's pagan. So what does that mean? So the Christians who, because they follow a metaphysical religion, they believe that they can be freed from the physical realm, right? They can get access to the metaphysical realm. Jesus gives them access to it. In fact, the story is about how Jesus gives them access to it. But as they went across the globe, this is the colonial project going across from, continent to continent, it didn't matter who they encountered, like Caesar would call an individual group like Druid, but Christian thinkers called them all pagan. Doesn't matter if you find them in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, it doesn't matter, they're all pagans. Why? Because they're all stuck to the earth. They cannot get free of the earth. They do not have access to the metaphysical realm. They have earth-based religions, and they're like stuck. You can't get them out. They're stuck in the earth, firmly there. Pagan continues in use today. A lot of people sort of like there's New Age paganism and all, which is interesting given its history. But today we'll talk about the Dream of the Rood because we have a collision of Christian and pagan worlds. So what happened was Christianity sort of collapsed when Rome collapsed, and for hundreds of years it didn't really thrive much at all. But then, right around this time, Christianity begins coming back, coming out of like the Middle Eastern part of the world and spreading across Europe. It's interesting because we think of the colonial project as like something from the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, but this is colonialism as Christianity first colonized Europe, and in this case, England. So what's interesting here, this functions not just like on that economic colonial register, but on a religious level too, because you have two deities here superimposed on each other. One of them is the central religious figure of Christianity, who's Jesus. And at the central event in Jesus's life, which is the crucifixion, and then of course the resurrection, which is alluded to here. He's on his way home to be with his Father in heaven, in a metaphysical realm. You also have a pagan Druid deity here. That's the Rood, who's been uprooted from the ground and hewn into a cross. So right off the bat, if you think of that iconic Christian image of Jesus on the cross, you're seeing both Jesus and what we always forget, which this story wants to remind us, there's a cross there too. And this is the story of the cross. And it's fascinating in terms of how it transitions Christians, which we'll get to in a moment. It's interesting because remember way back, Lynn White Jr. said that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion of the world. It's spread across the world. It destroyed earth-based religions. That's his thesis. Well, this is an example of it. This is an early example of Christianity spreading to Europe. Eventually, it will take over Europe, and then it will spread to the rest of the world. But how did it take over Europe? Here's an example of how it encountered a pagan religion, the Celtic Druid religion, and then did it all over the planet. So we could go through example after example. Lynn White Jr. alludes to the fact there are a lot of them. There are, but this is a good one to start with because it's an early one in the game. It's a transitional text, The Dream of the Rood. So let me explain why it's transitional or what it's transitioning from. It's intended to transition pagans, people rooted in the earth, into Christians. It uses the technique that we've encountered, doubling. So we saw that Gilgamesh and Enkidu are doubles. Enkidu is also a double with Humbaba. And the doubling here is the rood, the cross, and Jesus. And again, you imagine that image of Jesus on the cross, you see the doubling. It's perfect doubling there in the same shape. In so doing, and this is what's fascinating, the rood takes on some of Jesus's qualities and Jesus takes on some of the rood's qualities. But understand, I want to get to those qualities right away, and it should be apparent what's so interesting about this. But this text is designed to tell a story that would transition people from their religion, this Celtic earth-based religion, into Christianity. This will happen again and again. If you're going to transition people into Christianity, you have to make an argument for it, a reason for it, explain why to do it. This little story here explains why in a really concise, and I would argue, pretty provocatively compelling way. So, how does that work? They take on each other's characteristics. So Jesus is described in surprisingly heroic terms. So this, I'm quoting from the text itself. He's a young warrior. He's a hero. He's a mighty king. He's strong with a stout heart. Look at how he behaves here. He actively climbs the cross. He strips himself. He clearly takes on the characteristics prized by a warrior culture. So what's going on here? So if you're familiar with the iconography of the crucifixion as it will develop in the late medieval and Renaissance and today, you know that what's so remarkable about the crucifixion is this is God come to earth. This is God incarnate of the Trinity, right? This is the same God that created the whole universe in a few days. This is a God who could snap his fingers and destroy the planet. And yet he allows himself to allow this to happen. He lets these people drag him to the cross, nail him to the cross, and he doesn't do anything. He could end it instantaneously, but he doesn't. And that's why this will become central, especially like the Protestant thinkers like Martin Luther. His whole religion is called the Theologia Crucis, the theology of the cross. It is an abject, weak Jesus. That's part of the religion. This person is not strong. Why then describe him this way? Well, if you think about it, this is a warrior culture, right? Think of like, the Iliad or the Odyssey or, I don't know, Game of Thrones or something, where what's prized is strength and military, valor and that sort of thing. If you try to sell to these people this weak person who allows himself to be killed, it's not going to be such a good sell. I mean, people are going to say, well, we don't admire that. We don't admire people like that. So they describe him in very admirable terms. And this is something that Christianity will do as it spreads across the planet. It will take on regional characteristics and roll them into the religion for a while. And that's what's happening here. You come to a warrior culture, you want a warrior culture to accept your God, make him a warrior, at least for a while. And a few generations later, you can change the story. So the tree, and in this, the Celtic religion, the tree is powerful and mighty. The oak tree is like a sign of strength, right? It's huge, it's rooted in the ground. The tree takes on characteristics of Jesus saying, I am a powerful deity. I could have felled all the foes. I could have destroyed them with a snap, but I stood there. I followed Jesus's lead, and I didn't harm any of them, even though I could have stopped them all. So it's this new model being represented that this religion, the new religion has, but it's even being grafted onto the old one, where Jesus allows himself to die for the sake of others. That's the crucial thing here, right? Everyone gets into heaven. Why? Because Jesus died so you don't have to, so you'll have eternal life. That's the feature of the cross story. But the root is doing the same thing. I allowed myself to be cut down for the sake of this other, for the sake of Jesus. So it's fascinating. These two religions you would think they would be at loggerheads, but they're sort of dovetailing together. So the tree continues and describes his crucifixion. So remember, Jesus never talks here. It's just the tree. It's the only other speaker with the dreamer. Trees saying, "They pierced me with dark nails. The wounds are seen on me, open gashes of hate. I was all drenched with blood." And this is the blood from Jesus' side. Let me go to the next slide, and I can tell you right here, those words could have been spoken by Jesus, right? They pierced me with dark nails. The wounds are seen on me. This is the wound that a soldier makes in Jesus' side. Open gashes of hate. I was all drenched with blood. At this point, the moment of the crucifixion, they are the same. The tree is speaking, but it could just as well be Jesus speaking. So let me just unpack that a little further. The antagonists, so who's the people who've done or doing this? Who cut down the tree, made him into a cross? Who's the one who dragged Jesus there? Or they didn't drag him there. Jesus sort of, pushed them aside and climbed there. The strong foes who both seized me, the rude there, hewn me to the shape they wish to see, as well as crucified Jesus. They are Roman soldiers. And this is a very clever move because remember, Rome had conquered the British Isles centuries before, and that wasn't a very popular thing. They were a colonizing power. And fortunately for the people of the British Isles and their way of thinking, Rome collapsed, those soldiers went away. But the cultural memory would have still been there. Who were like the worst people ever? Those were those Romans who came and did this to our island. Hey, perfect in this story. Roman soldiers are the bad guys because historically it's Roman soldiers who put Jesus on the cross. It's Roman soldiers who jabbed him in the side and killed him. So, there's that old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, this is such a clever move because you have a new colonizing group coming out of the same area, like Rome. And it'd be very easy to see them as like, here we are, Rome 2.0. And it kind of was because it's called the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is now here in England, and there'd be every reason to say, yeah, this is the same thing again. We're going to fight these people the way we fought them last time. This text makes very clear it's not the same people. In fact, our enemy is their enemy too. What a clever move when you think about it. But by connecting, and you're actually superimposing this new deity, Jesus, on the existing one. Early Christians were attempting, and the author of this, to assimilate the followers of this obviously pagan, pagus, rooted in the ground religion. And that's what it's set out to do. That's why it's a transitional text, but it's also a conversion document. It's trying to convert people into one another. But you might say, let me go to the next slide. Once they're transitioned into Christianity, brought into the fold in Christian language, those earlier features like worshiping the earth were abandoned. So within a few really generations, not even centuries, the notion of describing Christ as like a young warrior, and fierce and all, is going to give way. You still see this with Christianity. There are regional differences, like I think the go-to example will probably always be parts of South America, certain countries there, where you still have older religions being echoed. Even in England at this time, if you go to churches being built in the late medieval Renaissance period, 600-800 years later than this, you'll see up on the buildings, you'll see like gargoyles, you'll see green men, which are these earth deities, which look like men, but are actually plants. And they're not Christian. They're on Christian churches, but they're there because people knew them and had those figures. So, okay, let's do another eye clicker, Paul. I had a general question because we're focusing on fiction here. Just curious. I know not everyone's an English major, literature enthusiast, so I'm just curious. There's no right answer here. I'm also kind of curious in the age of TikTok and others, how many people are actually reading. So let's see. Interesting. Occasionally. Avid readers, 87. So there are 860 people. That means we have 10% of the class are roughly avid readers. And an even larger group, kind of almost 20%, if you don't read fiction at all. Yeah, okay. Well, that's interesting. That's why, by the way, if you take courses in the English department here, you can take courses that have nothing to do with like traditional literature like this. By the way, since the second poll was taking, a whole group of people just left, which is unfortunate since I'm going to give some answers that will show up on the midterm. So, okay. But if you take courses in the English department, you can do new media as well. So it's not just the film and media department at UCSB, but we have people doing what we call digital media. And they actually read the same way I'm reading these texts. They read digital texts as well, like TikTok. Okay. So let's get back here and finish with the Dream of the Rood. What's so interesting here and why this works is it's able to incorporate the destruction of the earth deity into the narrative as the tree's bond with the earth is severed in order to fashion it into a cross. So I get to this is the next slide too, and let me just lay it out here. So why would you want to switch from one deity to another? Okay, they're superimposed, they look the same, they're both bleeding, they both had nails put in them, but why would you switch? What's the thing? Well, this story made clear that that original deity is dead. This is like Humbaba being killed. The Greek soldiers are not unlike Gilgamesh when he cuts down Humbaba. He severs them from the earth. He loses all his powers. All earth-based religion deities get their power from the earth. They're a feature of the earth. So this deity has been destroyed. And right off the bat, that's pretty astonishing. I mean, that's sacrilege, right? You've killed the deity. So it'd be like in Christianity or something, if someone came along and killed Christ. But, and that's what happens here, but there's a difference. And this is why the new deity becomes so revered. Jesus is dead, like the tree is dead. He's been killed, looks like it's all over, except Jesus comes back to life. And Jesus then opens up a doorway into the metaphysical realm. So you have a God. What's your God done for you? Has your God saved you from death? Has your God surmounted death, surpassed death? No, your God, here it is. Your God's dead. It's dying now, and it's going to be dead. But this new God is different. This new God can surmount death. He proves it. 3 days later, that's the resurrection. He comes back to life and proves he can do it. But the promise is, believe in him. Forget about that old God. Take on the new one, Jesus. Believe in him. You can do it too. So that's a pretty strong argument. I mean, you know, if you're not happy with whatever 100 years or so you have here on earth, here's a religion that says, we will give you eternal life. Eternal life, wonderful life, perfect life, pleasant life. You've heard about locus aminis, pleasant places. Heaven is orders of magnitude beyond that. It's a really compelling argument. And you could say it, you know, you could just say it, that it's going to do that, and your religion can. But here it is actually enacted. I mean, this is like, you could imagine this being performed as like a play. And you can see at the end, you know, Jesus is triumphant, ascending to heaven, and there's the rood, the cross, probably knocked over, decaying and done. So it's a really compelling image that it puts forth. Christianity, and this is it, the unique innovation is that he is reborn on a metaphysical register. And that's, of course, impossible for the tree. The tree cannot do that. That's something that only Jesus can do. And because of Jesus, all the followers of Jesus can do too. So you're seeing the triumph of one deity but really the triumph of one religion over another is being enacted here. And you can see it from an environmental point of view. It matters. You have all these religions all across the planet that are earth-based, that, you know, people live and die and that's it. But Christianity comes along and says, forget the earth-based religion. And again, this is Lynn White Jr.'s argument. This new religion is going to free you. It's going to give you eternal life. And it's, I mean, from like a marketing point of view, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good selling point. And that is the most important thing. And again, we've talked about this in way back in lecture, I guess not that long ago, 5 and 6. The innovation here is the metaphysical realm, which we saw already kind of breaking into Western thinking with Shamash. But by the time you get to the Hebrew Testament of the Bible, and then with Christianity, with give it a couple thousand years of thinking, you get this, that, you know, the metaphysical realm, it's all about the metaphysical realm. And the physical, the earthy, has no counter to it. Putting my normal disclaimer, it's not to say that Christianity has to be at odds with, let alone eradicate earth-based religions, but historically, and this is Lynn White Jr.'s argument, that happened. And you could say it happened, see it happening here. You could see why, you know, Celtic religion fell by the wayside, why Druids just became a memory. It often has happened. Doesn't have to. It's of course how you interpret Christianity, how you interpret other religions, and it's not always going to be good. So we're going to read from Paradise Lost, and Milton raises the provocative question: who are all the, you know, these other religious figures in the world? Who is, you know, the Buddha? Who is, you know, Krishna? And Milton's answer is, these are all devils. They're here to mess with you. The only true religion is Christianity, and all the other religions have to go by the wayside. So it's a powerful argument that continues on for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that is the Dream of the Rood. So now we're going to jump forward some 100 years more to the Canterbury Tales. These were written, and in a minute I'll give you the chronology, but I just want to show you how pretty this is, in the late 14th century by Geoffrey Chaucer. We're going to get to this lecture 9, which will be after the midterm. But by the 14th century, Europe proper, and especially Italy, was already into the Renaissance. But in England, they were kind of a cultural backwater. When Chaucer's writing this in the 14th century, that's still the medieval period. So we're still firmly medieval, and we will finish with medieval today. And Chaucer's a fitting person to finish with because he is very late medieval. Oh, and also, just let me show you this. This book, isn't it just wonderful? So, you know, this is, of course, what's known as an illuminated manuscript. Why is it illuminated? It's another word of saying illustrated. But this is how these texts were made. This was entirely hand copied. Someone wrote out all the calligraphy there and then, you know, jumped into it with the embellishing it. So astonishing text, which also tells you something about Chaucer, who was very well regarded at the time. In fact, and I'll mention this later, when the printing press came to England, the first book that they printed was, not surprisingly, the Bible. The second book was the Canterbury Tales. So it's very important text in the cultural memory of England. So although it is technically the Middle Ages here in the year 1400, in Italy and other places, we would already call that the Renaissance. But just to be clear, so it's kind of tricky, because if you say, is this a medieval text written in the year 1400? Maybe, depends on where it was written. Written in England, it's a medieval text. Written in Italy, not. But from our point of view, know that the medieval period is a long one in England. We're 600 years away from the Ruthwell Cross. So you might think, you know, we think something like the Renaissance, you think, well, that's a really long period. But no, the Renaissance is like 200 years old, 200 years in length. This is like 3 times longer at 600. So we're jumping ahead pretty quickly. So Chaucer is 600 years from us, but his language is Middle English. different than the Dream of the Rood. What I read was kind of like it's kind of like High German, Old English or Anglo-Saxon. So it's close enough that we can read it. That's what you have in the reader. I'm sorry, it's kind of a rite of passage for English students taking English courses to read Chaucer in the original Middle English. If you have difficulty doing it, you can go online and find free modern translations of it. But if you go through it, I think you'll find you can read it. And the big tip to help you is read it aloud, because when you read those words aloud, even though they may not look quite familiar to, when you read them aloud, like they suddenly will seem familiar. Like a word like kynde, Kynde, looks kind of odd, but when you read it aloud, you're most likely going to pronounce it kind. And it became our word kind after the vowel change and the dropped that vestigial E. That, by the way, you don't have to know this. That's the original Old English word for nature, kynde. Mentioned that before, I believe. So the Nun's Priest Tale is what we read from Chaucer. And this is an example of a beast fable. So these are elaborately illustrated books. This is from the Nun's Priest Tale. What is so interesting here is that during this period, there's this incredible interest in animals all over Europe, England, especially in some ways. And they're not just, people aren't just, because you could say with like pastoral, there was an interest in sheep because every time you see a pastoral painting, there's sheep in it. But no, these are central. I mean, they're often, like the one that we're reading today, the person is kind of peripheral to it. What really is, the story really is about are animals, and they are often sentient, very human-like animals. In fact, I'm going to give you an example at the very end today, but I'll jump to it now because it might help you with it. Think Mickey Mouse, right? Mickey Mouse doesn't look like a mouse. If you watch, any early Disney thing with Steamboat Willie, he is like a person. So what's up with that? All these animals, what is the fascination with animals, having them be human-like? That, of course, is called anthropomorphism. So that means taking on the form of human beings. So just don't get that mixed up, because we have like anthropocentrism, which is human-centered, which is the claim made by Lynn White Jr. against Christianity. But anthropomorphic means to take on the characteristics of a human being. The Dream of the Rood contains an anthropomorphic treatment of a tree. Why? Because, well, it didn't have a mouth or any features of it, but it was sentient in the sense it's feeling and thinking and talking. So what we're going to see here is more of that. And animals are even better than trees because they have those features, right? They have mouths, they could talk, they have ears, they have all sorts of things, which Chaucer likes to talk about. Okay, more on the Canterbury Tales. So it's a little confusing. So what this is. So the Canterbury Tales, what it's about is a group of pilgrims, and these are Christian. So by the time of the Dream of the Rood, 800 Christian era to here, 1400, 600 years have passed. And in that time, Christianity has taken over the country. Everyone in this country, for the most part, is Christian, with a small, very small Jewish and even smaller Muslim population there at the time. So it's an all-Christian country. What do people like to do? They go on pilgrimages to religious sites. If you have a lot of money, you would actually go to like Jerusalem. That's huge to be able to make that trip. Instead, even people who are kind of wealthy would go to a site in Canterbury. The church at Canterbury is one of the sites that they go to. So it's a story about a whole bunch of pilgrims, religious pilgrims, going to a site. And that's why it's called the Canterbury Tales. Each one of them tells a story, at least was supposed to. Chaucer never finished it. We only have a few of them, but that was the idea. Most of the pilgrims, such as, in our case, the nun's priest, and that's a priest traveling with a prioress and nun, are further introduced in a prologue of their own. And we don't read the nun's priest prologue. So let me explain it again. There's a general story called the general prologue that introduces all the characters, tells why they're there, and I just told you that, why they're there. Then what happens in the story is every day they travel a little further and then they stop like at an inn, a pub for the night, and then they all sit around the fireplace telling stories. Every day a new person tells a story, and in this case the nun's priest tells a story, and we have a little prologue of that. The prologue explains in further detail who the nun's priest is and what he's going to talk about. I didn't have you read that. All you're reading is that story that he tells around the fire. That's the nun's priest's tale. It's one of the Canterbury Tales. So, you know, if this course were in Chaucer, you would have read the whole thing. You would have read the general prologue and each of the individual ones, but you just read the story. And the story is what interests us because it's about animals. The nun's priest tale, that's what we did read. And this priest, the nun's priest, is telling a story involving barnyard animals. Now, going back to what we did with pastoral, this is not meant to be read literally. So it's not like, think of Mickey Mouse again. It's not like you can see Mickey and Minnie Mouse. It's not like what mice actually are like living in, you know, a barn or something. It's meant to be read allegorically. They're talking, they're saying things, they're sending out a message that's allegorical. So forget about them as mice in this sense. And this is going to raise a big question, which I'm going to point to you at the very end. How much is this really about mice to begin with? And how much is this really about these barnyard animals? But for the most part, it is not about animals at all, but about human beings. And that's a startling thing to say because we have this fad for hundreds of years across Europe to be fascinated to talk about animals. You think we would learn so much about the interiority of animals and thinking about animals and what they feel and all, but they really become these sort of like empty, like puppets standing for human beings. But let's break into it. The words associated, so Chanticleer is the main character. He's the rooster who lives in the barnyard, and Pertelote is his wife, as she's described. It's actually his favorite wife. So already Chaucer likes to tell like bawdy parts of the story. The fact that Chanticleer has all these wives is interesting. But the words that are used to describe him and Pertelote, paramour, demoiselle, debonair, these are all, in fact, French terms. And what's really being done here, and this is like pastoral in the sense, remember I told you that people would write things in the pastoral mode so that they wouldn't get caught saying things that were politically unfavorable. This is a politically unfavorable thing that Chaucer is saying here. He is using these animals as stand-ins for people. What he's describing is, well, let me back up and tell you. At this time in England didn't have a very good sense of self-identity. I think that's fair to say. And as a consequence, with the aristocrats and the royals and the government in general, everyone spoke French. It's kind of odd. It'd be kind of like everyone in Washington, D.C., and both houses of Congress and all were speaking French. But it happened, and it would happen again in Russia as well later. And the reason for it is it was just felt that the English, language, English people, English culture was just sort of a backwater. And Chaucer is going to attack that. And Chaucer is making a huge statement on the importance of English language, English culture, and especially what he's writing about English literature here. So how does he do it? He decides to make, a laughing stock of all of those wealthy people who are trying to be what they're not. What do I mean? They're British people trying to be French. They're trying to have all the affectations of the French court, and they're failing because they're just mimicking it. And Chaucer you can't imagine a funnier way of doing it in a way. He has a bunch of barnyards animals doing the same thing. So they're trying to be like, he wants to be as debonair as possible. He's dressed in this plumage, and hey, roosters kind of had that red thing on the top. It kind of looks like some sort of silly hat that people were wearing, and that's what he's doing. He's critiquing the aristocracy and in fact, the king at the time. What's interesting here is that in recent decades, literary critics have looked a lot at how disenfranchised groups, such as women, so the earlier, the sort of second stage feminist criticism in the 1960s, the first stage being like the suffragette movement, they did a lot of that, and to great effect. And these were the early feminist critics, and we owe them all a great debt of thanks. But it followed then, and in some cases preceded too, that we also looked at not only on the gender, on the register of gender, but with class, race, religious conviction, nationality, sexual identity, sexual preference, and on and on. That has defined the way that we approach cultural phenomena. And that's great, because these texts can reveal to us an enormous amount about any of these things. But the interesting thing that's sort of missing here is that critics only very recently, for the most part, have looked to, in some sense, the most marginalized group of all on the planet, and that would be non-human beings, animals. And it's revealing that it took us so long to get there. It took us so long in a period, Chaucer's period, obsessed with, animals. Animals themselves sort of fall into the backdrop. And when we begin looking at the cultural backdrop, in so many ways, in the last, 5 or 6 decades, animals very late to the game. And even later are beings that aren't animals. So plants and all too have gotten interest, and that should interest it all, right? I mean, the fact that you could think about a forest and think about the rights of a forest and all. It's amazing it happens so late, given that if you go back to Gilgamesh, it was already there in the beginning, in the sense that the forest had rights and that were not able to be broached until Gilgamesh did. So another way of thinking about this, because we have another example that we can look to, is Varro's On Agriculture, which we read. If you read that from the point of view of animals, animal rights, animal identity, which we did, I think you'll learn an awful lot about, and I think it was all sort of cringe, that what we did learn about how horrible that relationship was. And, what rights were imagined for animals there, what were they entitled to, and it's very clear. I mean, if you read it on that register, which we did, about animals. So you can read any text that way. We're not going to do it all that much, but I wanted to have a little sort of off to the side doing it here. You can read the history of the West from the point of view of beings other than human beings. That's for sure. And we kind of did it with Varro, and it's harder to do with Chaucer. So what is the posture toward non-human life? In this case, this is all about birds. So it's an interesting parallel, right? Because Varro's On Agriculture was all about birds, pigeons too. It's certainly more pleasant than on Varro's farm, I mean, in that sense. But, the question is, does doing this, speaking for animals, having them act like human beings, do them any sort of service? Does this make you more empathetic? And that I think is the challenge. And it's a question. Well, let me just go to the next and last section for today, which isn't too long. It's been going on for a long time. So I give you Chaucer as an example, only because Chaucer's era was arguably the biggest era in Western history where this happened. Happens before were like Aesop's fables and all, but small. I'd say there's only one real challenger as far as a period to Chaucer's England, and that would be the 20th century. And that would, well, you all know it. If you've seen a Disney movie, you've seen one, you've seen so much of the anthropomorphizing of animals. It's all over the place. But the story of the country mouse and the town mouse, it's kind of like like a Disney story. There are these two together, and they have different features. But on the other hand, is it really about mice at all? So let me just jump ahead. What do when we do this, and it's the real question to ask, because it reveals something I think central about our relationship to animals. When you are preoccupied with animals, but you're just using them as stand-ins for human beings, what do you actually learn about the animals at all? So if you haven't read the Chaucer yet, The Nun's Priest's Tale, when you read it, ask that question. I mean, there are things that are there, but they're obviously played for laughs, right? So that in a typical barnyard, there are a lot of hens and there's only one rooster. So it's played for laughs that Chanticleer has all these wives and is very happy to impregnate them all. So it's like a joke. Okay. But what does that really tell you about animals? How does that elicit any kind of sympathy for animals? So what do you really learn about the country mouse from Aesop? I mean, do you learn anything? It's meant to be an edifying story about how we should behave. The moral of the story that life in the country is better than the city, yeah, that's not for animals. It's literally not saying, animals that live in the wild have it better than animals that live in cities, like rats who have to kind of get whatever they can get. In the wild, it's better. There's nothing like that. It's not about that. It's about how people in the city have a better life. People in the country have a better life than the city, which of course is this thing we've seen again and again and again, most recently with Pastoral, which keeps telling that story. And then the real question is regarding this, you have this flurry of fascination with animals, but, does it do anything to make you more sympathetic, more caring, more interested? Like you want to learn more about them. Does it do anything like that? I would argue that Chaucer probably does less to make you sympathetic than Varro did, even though Varro didn't intend it that way. I think it's just, when you get to that line where Varro says, to keep profits up, you should break the legs of the chickens. I think that moment will it's kind of like a litmus test. For some people, that will elicit enormous sympathy, maybe to tears. And for other people, they'll say, oh, note that's how you make more money. But clearly, the Nun's Priest's Tale is not either inadvertently, like that text, or intentionally doing that. Anthropomorphically depicting animals can, to some extent, maybe. I mean, I'm raising this as a question. It's going to be the last question I ask you today. Last question for the first half of the class. Does it elicit sympathy? Does this story, does Mickey Mouse, does Donald Duck, do they elicit sympathy? Because they try to make non-human life more human. It's an interesting project, though, right? I mean, in the sense, if that's the only way you can do it. In other words, I would argue that one of the reasons we find Varro effective today, when we read about the pigeons having their legs broken, is we connect up with them as sentient beings. We know what it is to feel. Because of what we know about DNA and our relationship to them, we know that they have legs like we have legs. We know that they feel pain like we feel pain. We can imagine what it would be like to be left with legs broken, and we're horrified. Not because we see them exactly like human beings, but because we can connect up with them as sentient beings that are related. Not the same, but related, which
if you believe in evolution, we definitely are. Anthropomorphic depictions of animals, I've been alluding to this, exceptionally common in our culture. And here he is, Steamboat Willie, AKA in later years, Mickey Mouse. He acts like, dresses like, talks like, in most ways is more like a person than a mouse. Doesn't resemble a mouse, right? He's standing upright. Mice don't stand upright. They don't wear clothes. They don't do that. He is, for all intents and purposes, like a person. And that's the question. So this is a short lecture because I wanted to make sure we finished it before the midterm. So here's the last question, and then think about this, and then we can go. Does this make us more sympathetic? So was the medieval period in England a period of deep caring about animals? Did it elicit more caring because of the project, or not at all? So people are thinking about this very quickly as they're leaving. The answer is, yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. I would comment, but no one would hear me anyhow as you're walking out the place. So.